This is Trend Following Radio, where great thinking comes alive. Nobel Prize winners, legendary traders, best-selling authors, and the pros that know what drive us irrational human beings. I am your host, MICHAEL COVEL. Not filtered, raw, honest. That's my passion. My guest today is Richard Smith. He is chairman of the board and executive director of the Foundation for the Study of Cycles. Now, before you get confused, given my background, I first met Richard a few years back at an event in Las Vegas. I actually had no idea when this episode was coming together that it was the same Richard. But I'm happy to have him on because at his foundational level, he has the trend following mindset. He has the stop loss mindset. And look, at its heart, at the inception of this podcast, having the trend following mindset, trend following traders on this show is what I do. That's who brought me to the table. That's who brought me to the game, are all you traders out there that enjoy these kinds of conversations. Without any further delay, let's jump right in with Richard Smith and discuss cycles, discuss trends, discuss risk management, discuss behavioral finance, and all those fun things that go along with this subject that my life has been built around. Without any further delay, let's jump right in with Richard Smith. I did not connect all these dots because Brad Rotter, who's been on this show many times, did not seemingly connect me very well in terms of, I just trusted his recommendation. I figured, well, I'll look up Richard when it's time to talk to him and I'll do my homework like I do before all of my guest interviews. And then I started going through your stuff and I'm like, hold on. I know this Richard. I know this Richard. I was having a drink with this Richard at a cafe or a lounge in Vegas 2 years ago.
That's right.
Crazy small world, right? I still remember that week, though, in the sense that I had to take 3 flights to get to Vegas coming from Asia. So I was an absolute wreck the whole time you saw me.
Yeah. Where are you in Asia?
I'm in Saigon.
A busy place these days, huh?
Yeah. COVID has sapped everywhere. Here we have done our share of lockdowns and distancing and all that kind of stuff, but there's really no internal spread here. So that's nice.
Excellent.
And where are you?
I am in Southwest Virginia in the Blue Ridge Mountains.
Near Virginia Tech, near Ferrum?
Near Virginia Tech, yes,
okay.
Indeed. Good. You must be from this area.
I grew up in Vienna, Virginia, 22180. I used to
excellent.
Drive down 81, cutting through, I guess, to JMU or cutting down south to the Rocky Mountains. What's that road that cuts you straight down to the mountains in the North Carolina?
Blue Ridge Parkway?
There's a highway that when you get close to Tech, you go direct south.
77?
Yeah, I think so. Yes.
Yep. Yeah, it's a beautiful area.
81 and the tractor trailers, though, boy, it's a...
Oof.
Yeah. You got to be on your toes, don't you?
I stay off the roads on 50 acres in the Blue Ridge Mountains with fiber optic internet.
There you go. Did you grow up that way?
No, I grew up in Southern California.
How did you decide there?
Sold my business earlier this year, and wife and I moved to our dream home.
Southern California to Southwestern Virginia is not exactly connective tissue.
I was born in the military. I've been all over. My parents were from South Carolina. We ended up in Southern California, where my dad went for his master's degree at USC. Then I went to Berkeley, moved up to Portland, Oregon, grad school in upstate New York, met my wife there, lived down in Florida for the past 15 years, and retired to Virginia.
That part of Virginia is really, you've got your fiber optic, but you can almost be detached from what so many people think of as America. I mean, it's really, right?
Yeah, it's diverse. It's a nice blend of liberal and conservative.
Yeah. Well, cool stuff. Congratulations.
Thank you. Yeah, I was actually rereading your intro to The Complete Turtle Trader, remembering that you had some roots in this area.
Did I say anything good there? I mean, in the book?
Absolutely. And now I'm really excited to talk to you about it because you and I have so many common interests, I would say.
Yeah.
The whole turtle trader experiment is still one that I think is not widely appreciated. And that whole spirit of how do we really help the investing and especially the retail investing public understand what really works in the markets. Such an incredible story, and you did such an incredible job telling it. I've been telling more people about it.
Well, you know what's so cool about that story is, I know you know this, is it's the two things, really. It's the technique, it's this interesting technique, then it's the deliberate practice of essentially taking anyone. That's not completely fair to say, but the idea that you could, here's a cool technique, and if you apply deliberate practice, you can get something really interesting.
Absolutely. And to me, it all connects back to the linchpin, which is behavior.
Mm.
My background is in areas like complexity science and mathematics. Did my PhD on stuff like Kahneman and Tversky. And it took me a while to actually end up connecting it to investing. I started out investing in 98, 99, right in the dot-com boom, right? And boy, I was patting myself on the back there for 12 to 18 months. And then March of 2000 hit, had a good wake-up call. Eventually, I started discovering risk management, trailing stop losses, and made some pretty extraordinary discoveries, and then connected it to Kahneman and failure and loss aversion, how we're risk seeking with our losers and risk averse with our winners. And it was just a huge light bulb, and realizing how much behavior drives investing success and failure, and that it's really kind of the missing ingredient. And then nowadays, you have so much going on with behavior. I don't know if you followed the surveillance capitalism thesis and what's going on in social media, if you've seen The Social Dilemma.
I saw that. Great film.
A great film. To me, it echoes so much what I know you see in the markets and what I've seen in the markets, which is that we have all of these kind of weaknesses that we come into the markets with. Should we talk about being risk-seeking with your losers and risk-averse with your winners for a few minutes?
I'll drag you there. I'll keep you at Kahneman for a second. I think what's so interesting about him, and I've been fortunate enough to have him on this show, frankly, he probably changed the direction of this show, because once you have your first Nobel Prize winner, you kind of get a little like, ooh, I can ask anybody to come on now, right? You're like, ooh, I must be good.
Yes, right.
What's interesting about him and his work and what he did from an academic standpoint is that you and I, and you brought up the turtle story, that guy that did the turtle story, Richard Dennis, he had figured out everything that Kahneman figured out for the Nobel Prize and was doing it in the 70s as a trader.
Yeah, that's incredible. I loved that point. That kind of hit home for me too.
There's quite a few traders like that. So it's really interesting. And you mentioned you've got a PhD, so it means you've snuck around the academic corridors a little bit. You kind of maybe have seen both sides of this angle. It's somewhat interesting that you can have these great traders who never played the academic game, but they figured out all this Nobel winning stuff long before the people that often got credit for it.
Yeah, and I think that's so fascinating about markets and what they have to teach us about life.
When I was sitting here and preparing for our conversation, and I guess maybe one of the key words that we would talk about today, we're going to talk about a lot of things today, but one of the key words was cycle. When I was making notes, and it's interesting that you brought up the word behavior, my notes that I have right here was cycle equals behavior. Cycle equals behavior.
That's right.
We're going to open up the floors to how you define a cycle and why it's important and some of the background of the institute you're involved in. But let's speak to the word cycle. I like to be a curious skeptic in the sense that, okay, clearly there is often cyclical behavior you can see out there. Now, whether one can use it effectively to trade, this can get into all kinds of debates and whatnot. But let me open the floor up to you and define cycle from your perspective, because this is an important word to your life at this moment in time.
It is. At the simplest level, a cycle is a regularly repeating pattern with peaks and troughs. Right now, I'm looking at a chart of what is this Bitcoin. There's a 393-day cycle in Bitcoin. So from July of 2018, we saw a peak in Bitcoin. The next cycle top in Bitcoin was predicted for August, September of 2019, year and a couple of months later. Year and a couple of months forward from that, and that puts us right at about today, where that long-term cycle in Bitcoin is topping. A regularly recurring event, the moon going around the earth, is a cycle.
That's one right off the bat. You just laid out two examples. Now, the skeptic in me is going to have to dig in more to understand the Bitcoin cycle. And I'm sure there's people listening that are immediately thinking, ooh, this is really interesting. I wonder where Richard is going. And then there's also people thinking, no effing way. But when you say moon, nobody's going to argue that there's a moon cycle. So it becomes really interesting to unpack, because that's a great factual, concrete thing. Everyone knows that there are the planetary cycles.
Those are the cycles that we know about, but there are cycles that we don't fully understand, like the presidential cycle in the stock market, which is going on right now.
I'll bite. What's the presidential cycle?
Every 4 years, the stock market follows a relatively predictable pattern leading into the presidential cycle. And the McClellan family, Sherman McClellan of McClellan Oscillator, his son, Tom McClellan, have done an absolutely extraordinary job in their newsletter of documenting and following the presidential cycle year pattern. So you literally just take every 4 years and you average out what the stock market does in the year of a presidential election, and you see a top in early September, you see a bottom going into late September and repeating again in mid-October. And then, of course, you've got the kind of October lows typically, followed by rallies into January and February. I mean, it's tracking practically to the day in this 2020 election year.
You have looked at the data probably more than I have. You've looked at the cycles more than I have. I'm going to go back in memory and say the fall of 2008. I would tend to think that if we did not have the September-October meltdowns, that Barack Obama never would have been president. I mean, that's how important these stock market moves are towards elections. If I take it back to Al Gore and Bush, I seriously doubt Bush would have ever become president if we had not had the dot-com crash.
And the rally leading into Bush's election. You mentioned cycles and behavior.
Yes.
Let's go back to that. So why should these cycles persist? It does really suggest to us that cycles are intimately connected to human behavior. And I certainly think that they are connected to human behavior. And I think Edward Dewey, who was the founder of the Foundation for the Study of Cycles back in 1941, he founded the Foundation for the Study of Cycles. And I think he was one of the original behavioral economists. Talk about a guy who predated Richard Dennis and predated Kahneman and Tversky and Thaler and all these guys. He was one of the chief economists in the Hoover administration, and he was tasked with trying to figure out what caused the stock market crash and ensuing depression. He talked to 100 different economists and got 100 different answers. Met Chapin Hoskins, who was one of the top editors at Forbes at the time, started learning about market cycles. After that, connected it to cycles in wildlife populations in Canada, became fascinated with how cycles work, connected them to human behavior. I think that continues to be a theme that we don't fully understand as humanity, and we kind of keep our heads in the sand about it, in part, Michael, because it has this kind of uncomfortable significance or insinuation that we're not fully in control of everything that we think we're in control of. The market's going to regularly follow a presidential cycle pattern in election years. What does that tell us about our agency in moving markets? Those are tough questions for our progress-obsessed culture that we live in today, where everybody thinks they're doing everything.
Well, what's really interesting about you bringing up the gentleman Dewey going ahead and saying, let's try and figure out the causes of the Great Depression, talking to 100 economists and getting 100 different answers. Ultimately, it kind of reminds me of my trend following perspective. With trend following, you're kind of like, okay, here's the 100 different fundamental answers. But the one thing that we know for sure that's true is the traded market price at this moment in time. It's about the only thing we know for sure. And in some ways, I don't know if you're going to connect the dots exactly. It rings to me when you make that setup, because it's kind of like he investigated the fundamental explanations from all the assorted economists and then was looking for something else to explain the behavior, correct?
Yes, exactly.
Expand this out, because this perspective, this cycle perspective from your perspective, is far more than the markets, where you've mentioned the wildlife in Canada. Connect this for us skeptics out here in the audience that are kind of like, give me some more connective tissue here. I've got my hands on my head. If I do understand, for example, the presidential market cycle, we still, if things don't go our way, if we make the big prediction, and you mentioned the trailing stop at the beginning, and I know that's part of your background, even if we take the timing indicator, whether it's a momentum timing indicator or a cycle timing indicator for the presidential election cycle, you still got to have a stop, because there's really no 100% chance that any timing indicator is going to be 100% accurate.
Absolutely. One of my early mentors, Jake Bernstein. You know Jake?
I don't.
I mean, he's written 40, 50 books on the markets. He's been around for 50 years. He's on the board of directors of the Foundation for the Study of Cycles with me. But he tells a great story about talking to some cattle ranchers down in Alabama in the 70s. They take him to introduce him to the best trader that they know. And this guy is using pendulums over the stock ticker page in the newspaper. Jake's like, is there anything else you're doing? And he says, well, there is one thing, but it's not that important. And Jake's like, well, what is it? He says, well, if a stock is down in the first 3 days after I buy it, then I get rid of it. I think that money management is ultimately the most important thing that anybody who's in the markets needs to be thinking about. And it's certainly where the focus of my work in the markets has been. Cycles can be very seductive. They can certainly lure you into a false sense of certainty. And they do have to be taken with a sense of skepticism and combined with money management all the time.
Speak to this example, though. I want to get into a little bit deeper, if you can, the presidential market cycle. What is the behavior? What is the psychology that's potentially driving some of the movement that you talked about in September and October? Now, me, as a novice on the outside looking in, I can say, okay, basically people are tuned out for July and August. We know everyone's on vacation or they're messing around. Then the moms get the kids back to school, and then we're into mid-September, and then everyone starts thinking about the election. Now, I'll let you take it from there.
Yeah, well, I don't think it's just about what everybody's thinking about. I think it's what the political parties are also doing to help try to shape the election. Right now, for example, you have a pretty accommodating Federal Reserve providing a lot of liquidity. Then you combine that with the general tendency of the market to kind of be flat to sideways, say from May to October, and rally from November through April, an annual cycle pattern that happens over and over again. I think it's still one of the most extraordinary patterns in the markets in general. But let's look at just taking it in the presidential year cycle. You have those kind of influences of which party is going to get reelected, literally a battle in the markets, and all of that human psychology kind of factoring in and accelerating as we get closer to the election, amplifying the moves that we see.
Do you find in your world right now the study of cycles? I have not had a chance to review it all. There's clearly a huge library that you guys maintain. How do you think technology and the connected tissue-ness of us today, all with a phone, all staring at Twitter, all taking in this information, it kind of reminds me in a way of like even before the phone. I mean, are we necessarily behaving any different now that we're all connected? I mean, to me, if anything, we're just a little more polarized. But if all this connection was changing too much, I mean, maybe America would have 3 parties or 4 parties, but we seem to have 2 very distinct parties and 2 very distinct points of view. What's your perspective on technology and cycles?
Technology is kind of accelerating the cycles. I think that what you're seeing of the polarization that's going on is connected to cycles because we are kind of cyclical creatures. Right now, technology, I think, has gotten ahead of human psychology. the powers that are in control of most of that technology are leveraging human psychology to basically drive their business models. I think it's really important that people become more aware of cycles so that they can help be in control of technology instead of having technology be in control of us. I think how you see that cycle that technology has, and social media technology has certainly driven polarization. We mentioned earlier the documentary, The Social Dilemma. The group that put that out, the Center for Humane Technology, makes the point that in this kind of social media or this attention extraction economy, a human being is worth more money when they're anxious, depressed, polarized, and isolated. Those are the best conditions for keeping us glued to our screens, going down any rabbit hole that piques our interest. Talk about biases, Michael, using confirmation bias as a business model, essentially, to drive people into our confirmation biases over and over again to the point that we can't even talk to anybody who doesn't share our same views. This is the business model that's driving much of social media and advertising driven technology today, where the user is the product. The fact that human beings have kind of cyclical natures, the fact that we're easily driven into our confirmation biases, those are powerful tools that I think technology has been capitalizing off of. It's really an important time that we all be looking at these questions and issues and figuring out how we can have a more humane technology.
The interesting thing about that film to me, I don't say this to be controversial, I think it's pretty well known, that the powers that be that own Amazon, Google, Apple, Facebook, and Netflix all go to one party in America. They're all left-leaning operations. The thing that I thought that was really interesting about that particular film on Netflix, a left-leaning company, is that Netflix put out a film that was really hitting hard on left-leaning, not necessarily peers, but left-leaning companies. And I think that was really interesting. I saw some people on the right that didn't really catch that. It made me think, gosh, there must be a much higher level discussion going on, because the people that were in that film, the people that put that film out, the people that distributed that film were by and large left-leaning, and they were ripping left-leaning companies. Now that's a really interesting pivot when so many people think everything is polarized, and it is polarized, but that subtlety with that particular program really struck me.
Yeah, I thought that was interesting too. You could tell that everybody in the film was from Silicon Valley. They all had that perspective still of kind of the left-wing point of view of how we get solutions.
They were concerned.
They were very concerned, and it was incredibly, I think, poignant and striking to see the very people who helped create this technology expressing that level of concern for the public to see. I've been concerned about this for a long time, and it grew out, Michael, of my experience in the markets and seeing how psychology works in the markets, seeing how our human weaknesses or our human sensitivities are manipulated in the markets and how we have to overcome those tendencies for our attention to get captured and kind of step back and have some objective ways of making decisions and engaging in this arena. And then just translating that to what's going on in technology today and what's going on in social media. I think a lot of this was learned from the capital markets, and especially when the capital markets moved into the digital world. I'm fascinated by that. I'm fascinated about how people kind of don't understand small probabilities. You combine that misunderstanding of small probabilities with our capacity for imagination, and you get making mountains out of molehills. You end up kind of being deer in the headlights, and you can't act rationally anymore because your emotions have gotten the better of you. On the one hand, it's depressing how far things have gone and how polarized they've become. But I think on the other hand, this is an incredible opportunity for a collective dialogue, a collective discussion, which I think the guys in The Social Dilemma have certainly elevated that conversation, invited that conversation for all of us to kind of take a step back and go, what's really going on here? What kind of future do we want? What relationship do we want to have to technology? I think that those of us including yourself, who have been so involved in markets for decades, have kind of seen how this psychology works, to be a part of that conversation and to frankly talk about how markets should be shaped in the future.
Let me shift you out of markets for a moment. I'll bring you back, but it just struck me as we're discussing the term cycle, many different types of cycles, well beyond markets, and climate change is such the conflict out there. I think the way that I look at it is it's highly political right now to me, but clearly humans have an effect on things. Now, it just starts with pollution, it starts with exhaust, etc., and that can have an effect on things. But then I like to go back in time and watch my dinosaur documentaries, and I start to look at something called Pangea. I realized that, when there was one supercontinent, it didn't make a difference whether there was people or dinosaurs or not. But if the continents once again coalesce to one Pangea number 2, so it's a really interesting conversation. It's like when you talk about cycles, there's the what length period are we talking? Because ultimately, at the end of the day, most likely human beings will probably come and go and the earth will keep rocking and rolling. And there'll be one supercontinent again, and perhaps there'll be dinosaurs again. Who the hell knows? These cycles, we only have so much control over something when it comes to climate and the planet.
Absolutely. And I think it's a great example where you see the sort of interaction of human cycles with planetary cycles and solar cycles. I mean, sunspots is something that we haven't talked about yet. Sunspots are an indicative of the sort of energy on the face of the sun, right? And how that comes to the earth. And right now, sunspots are in a decreasing phase. Many people think that we're heading into what's known as a global solar minimum, meaning a period of inactivity on the surface of the sun. Those are typically associated with periods of many ice ages. A lot of people who study sunspots and those cycles think that we're heading into a period of global cooling instead of a period of global warming. I think that human-caused global warming definitely needs to be part of the conversation, but it's obviously become a very political part of the conversation. And let's face it, there's a tremendous amount of money that's sloshing around the conversation around global warming. All of these things become not just political, but there's economics that drive these conversations in the human sphere. Science has certainly become big money. It drives a lot of grants and a lot of universities, et cetera. You have the same kind of herding, get on the bandwagon phenomena that we see in markets year after year and decade after decade. It's always this interaction of these kind of human, psychological, political cycles, economic cycles, and then these bigger cycles like sunspot cycles or, continental shift cycles. I can't really talk too much about those myself, but I do think they are things that we should be studying and should be part of the conversation. And ultimately, that's what the Foundation for the Study of Cycles seeks to do, which is really bring together different disciplines, look at cycles across different disciplines and across different time frames. There are short cycles down to the minutes. One of my friends in the market, Stan Ehrlich, he uses cycles on a super short time frame, intraday, presidential election cycles. All of these things come into play. We don't completely understand what causes cycles, but that's the mission of the Foundation for the Study of Cycles.
Back in the day, I guess maybe it came from maybe undergraduate econ classes or maybe in my MBA, you get exposed to the notion of a business cycle. As far as I can tell, once the Fed took off to the races post the dot-com crash, is there a business cycle anymore? It's kind of lost in the lexicon. This was a pretty big thing when we were younger. I mean, you would always hear the discussion of a business cycle. I can't remember the last time I heard that.
Ray Dalio came out recently and said, we don't really have free markets anymore. When somebody of Ray Dalio's stature says that.
He's a big cycle guy.
He's a big cycle guy himself. He's looking at longer term cycles. He's looking at 500-year-long currency cycles right now has been one of his big themes, and the rise of China and the decline of the US.
What's interesting when I listen to Dalio talk, and obviously he's got the money in the bank and the success. He's had a tough year this year, but he's got the money in the bank and the success to put out a message that people have to take serious. The hard part for me, I think, being trained in this trend following mentality, is I always look at it like, okay, maybe we have over here on the left-hand side of the ledger, we have the Ray Dalios and maybe the Jim Simons of the world that have figured out ways they can effectively predict. And then on the other side of the ledger, more the venture capital trend following mindset are the folks that say, even if there is a cycle, hell, we don't know how accurate it's going to be. We might as well use something simple and robust like a momentum indicator with a stop loss and just follow the trend. It's kind of like we're trying to get to the same place. It's a different mindset in some ways, those two perspectives.
I think that cycles and trend following are highly complementary. And I'm essentially a trend following investor and trader myself, but I find a knowledge of cycles to be very complementary to trend following and money management based techniques.
Is it partly for psychological reasons? Because as a trend follower, you don't have the foggy clue. I mean, you can go do the fundamental homework, but you really don't know why anything's happening. You're just following along. Do you find the study of cycles, if you have the trend following mentality and the trend following trading mentality, do you find the study of cycles for you is just kind of a psychological salve?
When I'm thinking about cycles in terms of markets, I think of cycles in terms of which way the wind blows. I think of cycles as kind of like a windsock at the airport. The wind might be blowing against you and you can see that through the windsock, but that doesn't mean that the airplane can't still take off. I think cycles are a lot like wind in the markets. And it's good to know which direction the wind is blowing. It doesn't mean that the market can't continue on against a headwind, but it's good to know if you've got a headwind or a tailwind. I think that when you have a knowledge of cycles, especially when you see a sentiment extreme going into a cycle top or a cycle bottom, when you combine cycles with sentiment, it can help you anticipate turning points in the markets when you're a trend follower. You're a trend follower, right? You're trying to catch the middle. You have to give up some at the beginning and some at the end. But what if you can improve your results by having a knowledge of cycles and getting a little bit more out of the beginning of that trend and maybe a little bit more out of the end of the trend as well. So that's where I think cycles can come in. If we go back to March of this year, the stock market cycles were predicting a top in the February-March timeframe, and that didn't necessarily mean that the cycles were predicting that COVID-19 was going to hit and that the market was going to fall 40%. But then when the market did fall 40% and you saw some radical sentiment extremes and all of that coinciding with a significant cycle bottom in the stock market, that was, for me, a time when it gave me more confidence to get in there and buy. And that turned out to be a profitable decision.
Yeah, trend following did exceptionally well in March of 2020 as well, too. It's the contrarian mindset. I mean, because look, ultimately, people either can just trust the system and trust the system being the S&P, just trust that system, which is arguably a trend following system too. You're going to trust the S&P system, or you say to yourself, I don't want to be with everybody. I want to be outside the herd. I feel more comfortable outside the herd.
Yeah, I mean, comfortable and uncomfortable, right?
Well, yeah, true. If you stay outside the herd long enough, I think in some ways you forget what the feeling of uncomfortable is. You just know you're comfortable not being with the herd. I don't know if I remember necessarily what uncomfortable is. I just know if that mass is over there, that mass scares me. If I'm in the middle of that mass, ugh.
The herd is often right in the middle, but wrong at the ends.
One of my favorite places, if you ever get a chance, I believe it's in Beltsville, Maryland. I believe it's called the National Agricultural Research Library. I've not been there for eons, but I somehow or another back in the day, because I wanted to find old prices. This was outside of DC, outside of the Beltway. And it was kind of like this, right off the Beltway, this kind of like obscure government tower with all of this basically farm research. I kind of realized, well, they're going to have a lot of interesting data there. So back in the day, I got in there and I talked my way into getting into the stacks that were basically, go up to the stacks of this place, and it's like all the economists going back 100 plus years. I remember walking by one stack and there was a newspaper from the day after Lincoln was shot, just sitting there, going through and just looking at all of this archival stuff. It's a nice reminder about people are people are people, because that kind of information, everyone thinks everything is on the internet. No, everything is not on the internet by any stretch of the imagination. So much is not on the internet. And I don't know, some generations are never going to understand that. They're never going to understand how much is not on the internet.
I hope that the study of cycles can be a part of mitigating that to some degree. So I think it is really important that we be aware of short-term cycles, but also that we be aware of long-term cycles, like the things that you're talking about.
Is cycle the same thing as trend in your mind?
No, I see cycles and trends as being kind of the two major forces in the markets that drive price. I think they're complementary. There was a wonderful little animation that I can't show on your podcast, but it shows exactly how when you take trend and you take cycles and you combine them together, you get behavior that looks incredibly like what we see in the financial markets. There are underlying trends and there are cycles. They both influence what happens in the markets on a day-to-day, week-to-week, month-to-month, and year-to-year basis.
It's an interesting perspective. You probably imagined I would walk in as skeptical as I possibly can be. I'm not necessarily sure where I stand. When I hear you, I know there's clearly cycles in all kinds of aspects of, as you mentioned, nature to biology to humanity to geography. It exists. I mean, for example, you guys talk about the earthquakes. But I think that the key for me is when you say we see the cycles in the data, we don't necessarily know why. I think if you were telling me why, I'd be even more skeptical. I'm less skeptical when you're saying, hey, Mike, I'm a data nerd too, that's in all the coding and I'm looking at all the data. I'm seeing something that looks tangible, but you don't necessarily know why. That's interesting to me.
Combine trend, money management.
And a stop loss.
The stop loss is part of money management. Volatility budgeting is a really fascinating topic when you get into behavior, because I think so much of what causes people trouble in the markets is really having unrealistic expectations about what might happen in the markets, but that's another conversation. Layer cycles on top of that, an awareness of cycles, which it's like breath. Breath is a cycle, and the market has its own breath, not breadth, not B-R-E-A-D-T-H, but literally B-R-E-A-T-H. And I think cycles show us the different breathing patterns of the markets. They can be a really powerful tool for anybody that's interested in the markets. But sometimes they're so spot on that you just start to get captivated by them, and then you're wrong, and your confirmation bias kicks in, and you can really get yourself in trouble. I think that all three of these components have to be continually followed and integrated, and that's trend, cycles, and money management. And those are all really great tools for anyone in the markets.
As we wind down, let me take you back to the 50 acres in southwestern Virginia. You're basically in the bug out area. So if you're already bugged out there in the wilderness, so to speak, but if you really need to bug out, you are in one of those spots. And for people that don't know that area, I mean, you can go get lost somewhere in Appalachia. They're never going to find you in about, what, a grand total of 30 minutes? I mean, really, right?
Yeah. Yeah. It's an incredible area. Happy to be here.
There's a lot of parts of that area of the world, and we're talking going down from, I guess, Pennsylvania, Maryland, West Virginia, North Carolina. I mean, I guess down in Tennessee too. There's parts of America that are in some ways unexplored in Appalachia.
Going back to the cycle stuff for my family and I, it's partly about reconnecting with nature, getting out of the urban environment where things are so disconnected from the circadian rhythms of life.
There's a cycle right there, right? The circadian rhythm.
Yeah. And getting back to what's going on with technology, technology has radically disrupted our circadian rhythms. It's one of the ways that technology kind of weakens our psyches, weakens our ability to kind of process our emotions and be emotionally intelligent by disrupting our circadian rhythms. I think a lot of people are feeling that need right now to kind of reconnect with nature and reset our circadian rhythms, which is another area that the Foundation for the Study of Cycles is very interested in contributing to the ongoing societal dialogue on that topic.
A real simple, quick hack for people, heuristic, they can test it themselves. I've had it happen to me. I pretty well convinced. I had a sleep expert on this podcast talk about it, and then I kind of followed up on my own experimentation. But if one falls asleep at night and perhaps they're listening to some podcast on their phone, and perhaps the phone is relatively close to your head, if that thing is not in sleep mode, your sleep is going to be messed up. If it is in sleep mode, I can't say for sure it won't be messed up, but I tend to think there is a difference that when you turn this stuff off, the circadian rhythm completely changes.
Yep. I always put my phone in sleep mode if I have it in my bedroom at night, but lately I've just not been taking it in the bedroom,
Smart.
When you're in sleep mode, you wake up in the middle of the night. It's so easy to grab that thing and get it out of sleep mode and turn something on. And the bedroom is where you should sleep.
Do we really trust that Mr. Apple can't flip the sleep mode while we're asleep and turn it on and take pictures of us? Who knows what's going on, right?
I mean, or at least capture that, upload it when you get out of sleep mode, right? Yeah, who knows what's going on?
Who knows what's going on, right? It's all part of the matrix.
Well, sleep is one of these things that has kind of gotten back into the public awareness. I think it's a very positive development that people, again, are concerned with issues of sleep and talk about a cycle and a circadian rhythm, a recognition of the restorative properties of that. I think that's a great example of how a knowledge of cycles can really help restore some balance to what has become sort of a progress obsessed and technologically driven culture that everybody's kind of waking up to going, I think there are some questions we need to be asking here about where things are heading. And I think those are healthy conversations.
Richard, cool stuff. Nice to reconnect. It's been about 2 years, as I said at the top. Where can we send people? Where would you like to direct people? I know there's a website to send them to.
It's simple, Michael, cycles.org. The Foundation for the Study of Cycles is a 501c3. So we're a not-for-profit educational corporation. We're in our 80th year. People can learn about us at cycles.org, and you can also become a member at cycles.org, get access to our Cycles scanner, which you can use on your own data, as well as any of the data in the U.S. markets.
Cool stuff, Richard.
Thanks for having me, Michael.
Thanks for coming on. We'll have to reconnect in person again when I make it back to the States once the COVID cycle is over. Who knows how long the cycle's going to go on.
A very nice little guest house here in the Blue Ridge Mountains if you're ever in the neighborhood.
The family lives outside D.C., so it's only about 3 hours away.
Great. Well, hopefully we'll do it sooner rather than later. Let's talk again.
I see a time when those awake will understand how to make money in up, down, and surprise markets. Whether new trader or experienced, college student or financial advisor, protecting against a crash or just trying to make a lot of money, trend following offers everyone an answer in uncertain times. To get started immediately, send me an email, michael@covel.com. I will send you the right trend following steps to take along with my free video. But if you want to buy and hold, trust the government and trust Wall Street, this is absolutely not for you.